Hello. This is Mr. Bigland, and this is GCSE Film Studies. Today's topic is going to be a brief history of South Africa, and this topic is linked to your global film set text, which is Tsotsi. What we're going to be talking about is how the history of South Africa as a nation, how the history of apartheid and the legacy that apartheid left is revealed in the themes, characters, scenes from and within the film Tsotsi. So what we're going to be looking at is how that legacy of apartheid, how the legacy of the history of South Africa is shown to us through the characters, through the place, through the setting, through the mise en scène, through the film language, and all of that really good stuff. So let's get into it. So, as always, before we start any study topic, we want to know why we're studying this and why we're studying it now. So why this? Well, examining the historical context that surround a film text, it's one of the higher order skills that provides you with a greater understanding of the issues that surround that text. And applying context to your answers in an exam situation, it's showing those higher order exam skills which are going to push your grades up from the grade 5 to the grade 6s, 7s and above. It helps us develop our understanding of the contextual issues, how political, historical, economic kind of history of a place or a point in history is represented and shown to us through what goes on in the film. And it's also a really good cross-curricular skill that can be applied across multiple different subjects. You may have looked at the history of South Africa and apartheid in your history lessons, but also applying historical context is a really important skill when it comes to English literature as well. You may be studying war poetry, and obviously having an understanding of the First World War gives you a greater understanding of the poems that you're studying. So why are we studying this now? Well, learning about the history of South Africa is one of the most important contextual elements to your study of Tsotsi. The film itself revolves around a township outside of Johannesburg in post-apartheid South Africa. So apartheid has come to an end, and what we're witnessing is the legacy, the impact on that township in South Africa, in Johannesburg, that apartheid has had and continues to have. And gaining an understanding of that historical, economic and cultural context that surround the film, that surround Tsotsi, will help you understand why the film represents its characters and environment in the way that it does. And remember, the key focus for this film is representation. We're going to be looking at media language as always and film language as always, but the key focus, the specific focus, is representation. So we're going to be looking at how the representations in the film are contextually linked to the history of South Africa. One of the most important things we can look at before we start looking at the timeline, before we're looking at the legacy and the impact of apartheid and how that is shown in Tsotsi, is understanding very clearly what apartheid was. And apartheid was a policy. So it was a political movement, a political law, a policy enacted in South Africa, which was a system of segregation and discrimination on grounds of race. In 1948, the South African government formally invoked apartheid as their system of government, but it had been building up to that point, and there was segregation and discrimination on grounds of race much earlier than 1948. It's just in 1948, post-war, post-Second World War, that the system was formally adopted by the South African government. Apartheid is Afrikaans for aparthood, or separateness, and the name was intended to embody the way the white ruling class wanted to separate themselves in every way from the non-white population. This system of apartheid forcefully separated the different social groups into 4 categories. There were the whites, who represented only about 20% of the population of South Africa. A lot of those white people were descended from British and Dutch colonies, which had initially settled in South Africa much earlier in history. That was obviously the ruling and the predominant social group. Then there was the coloured social group, and they were people of mixed heritage. There was the Indian social group, and finally the black social group. And these groups lived and developed separately, and even though they all lived in South Africa, it was made almost impossible, and in some cases illegal, for them to actually mix. This system of government, it had the biggest impact on the black African population, as they were considered to be the lowest of those four social groups. They were forced out of their homes, moved to rural areas or townships, and townships were these kind of shanty slum towns which kind of grew around the major cities, whereas the major cities were controlled by the minority white population. These townships were unplanned, overcrowded, and they had few, if any, amenities: running water, electricity, education, healthcare. They lacked pretty much every facet, every element of what we consider to be a proper city, a proper town. And the white minority used their political power to disenfranchise the rest of the population. And that word disenfranchise means basically take away the rights, take away any way of improving their situation, and basically forcing them into this cycle of poverty and violence, which was endemic and ongoing. They used the police and military to implement harsh and unjust rules that lasted for over 40 years, and the black population are still feeling the impact of apartheid rule to this day. What we're going to do now is we're going to look at the history of apartheid and how the apartheid rule progressed over the 40 plus years that it was the system of government in South Africa, and how laws were introduced to effectively disenfranchise, dehumanise and segregate the white racial class, the ruling racial class, from those that they deemed to be lesser racial classes than them. As we've already said, apartheid was made law in 1948, and it was an authoritarian culture which was dominated by the white minority, who were mainly of Dutch and British ancestry, and they only made up approximately 20% of the overall population of South Africa. Over the next few years, so the National Party, which was the name of the ruling white government party, introduced a series of laws that embedded segregation in South Africa. In 1949, mixed marriages were made illegal, and in 1950 it was made illegal to have any kind of sexual relationship with anyone outside your racial classification. And what that meant was that if you were of the white racial class, you could only have relationships with other people of the white racial class. If you were of the black African racial class, you could only have relationships with people from the black African racial class. And they classified these races in a variety of different ways, some of which were incredibly dehumanising. There's the example there of one of the tests to prove if you were a black African was being made to run a comb through your hair, and if it got stuck, then you were identified as being a black African and of the lowest racial class in South Africa. In 1953, schools became segregated, and schools for non-whites were not allowed to teach academic subjects and were intended only to prepare students to become labourers. And what that meant was it removed any opportunities for black Africans or anybody of the non-white African social classes, racial classes, to be able to improve themselves and better themselves through education. They just weren't allowed to study the academic subjects, which would allowed them to achieve greater economic opportunities. So it really restricted what black Africans and what other racial classes were allowed to do in terms of job roles. But that wasn't the only way that the white ruling racial class expressed their power over the black Africans and the other racial classes, and one of the other ways was extreme violence. In 1960, the Sharpeville massacre took place, and this is an event where, at a peaceful protest in a black township, police opened fire. 69 people were killed, including 10 children, and 180 people were injured, including 19 children, and the police shot many in the back as they turned to flee. And what this demonstrates is the extremes that the white minority government were going to go to maintain their control over the population of South Africa. They weren't afraid of using violence. They weren't afraid of using the military. They weren't afraid of using extreme force. Between 1960 and 1983, over 3.5 million black Africans were removed from their homes and forced into townships or rural tribal lands. So they were pushed out of the cities, they were pushed out of the more economically rich areas of South Africa into extremely poor areas of South Africa. Between these years, more and more laws were introduced to ensure that non-white citizens' rights were curtailed, were halted. In 1969, non-white citizens were barred from being able to vote, so there was no democratic way of black Africans being able to express their views on the white African government. Non-white citizens were not allowed to run businesses in white areas. Hospitals became segregated, and hospitals for whites were better funded, better staffed, less overcrowded, and this had a severe impact on the health and mortality rates of non-white citizens whose healthcare was much less funded, was staffing was much worse, and they were much more overcrowded. And women were deprived of their human rights as well, and many were forced into domestic or agricultural work. So how did apartheid come to an end? Well, in the 70s and 80s, global opposition to apartheid continued to grow, and the South African government found themselves becoming increasingly isolated politically and globally. And a political group called the ANC, which stands for the African National Congress, which was led by an imprisoned Nelson Mandela, were responsible for pressuring for change in the South African government. And whilst Nelson Mandela was in prison, the South African government met with him secretly to see if they could talk about peace in the future. In 1990, the president at the time, F.W. de Klerk, announced that the ANC would no longer be banned and that Nelson Mandela was going to be released from prison. And in 1994, this led to the first free election in South Africa in decades. Black and white people got to vote together, and the vote would decide who would be in charge of the country. And the ANC won. And Nelson Mandela became the president of South Africa, and this was an absolutely huge day across the world, and the election day is now celebrated as Freedom Day in South Africa. So legally and politically, much changed in South Africa, with people of all races now free and equal under the law. Anyone is technically able to live, work and study anywhere, and people are free to interact and marry across colour lines. Black South Africans have democratically governed through the ANC for the past 30 years, compared with during apartheid when it was illegal for a black person to even vote. But the legacy of apartheid is still a huge part of South African culture. Despite the significant gains, despite apartheid ending, it is still present economically and spatially, and it's contributed to South Africa being one of the least equal countries in the world. It has left enduring scars on the country. Economically speaking, black households earn less than 10% the average monthly income of white households. Black households on average bring home $552 a month, whereas white households on average bring home over $6,000 a month. And in that image you can see spatially how South Africa is still segregated, with the much more economically expensive housing on one side, which would be predominantly owned by white Africans, compared to the township just across the side of the road on the other side, which would predominantly have a black African population living there. In terms of housing, since the end of apartheid, there's been a significant increase in the number of black Africans who now live in South Africa's cities, but townships still exist, and they account for a quarter of the population. So approximately 12 million people still live in townships today. And these townships suffer from a variety of structural issues. There's limited access to clean water, there's a lack of effective sanitation, and that leads to disease. There's a lack of electricity supply, and there's poor transportation links. In terms of education, schools are officially mixed, but in reality, a lot of schools are still segregated because black families just can't afford the transportation costs to send their children to the better schools, which are in the cities. Schools in the townships have a variety of issues. 3,500 schools have no electricity supply at all. 2,500 schools have no access to running water. Over 11,000 schools still use pit latrine toilets rather than having plumbed toilets, which we would be used to using in Western countries. 79% are without any libraries, 77% are without any computer centres. So you can see that legacy of apartheid and how it's still impacting on the education of South Africans, especially black South Africans today. And in terms of violence, gangs and violence are a huge problem in the townships, and children as young as 12 or 13 get initiated into local gangs. Some see violence as gangs as a way of life and a part of their culture. The weapon of choice for most is a gun, which are easily accessible. It's estimated out of the 14 million guns in circulation in South Africa, only 4 million of those are registered and licensed to legal gun owners, which means that other 10 million guns are in the hands of criminals who are willing to commit violent crimes. And in recent years, the violence has been so extreme that the government have been forced to send the army into the townships to keep the peace. What we need to do now then is we need to apply everything that we've learned about the historical, cultural and social context of apartheid rule to our set text, which is of course Tsotsi. And we're going to start by looking at age and ethnicity. And these are two areas of representation that we're starting with because these are the two areas that are most affected by the legacy of apartheid. And it's important to note that we're talking about the legacy of apartheid here because during the events of the film, apartheid has finished, it has ended. So we're looking at the impact of apartheid over the previous 40 years and how that is demonstrated to us through scenes in the film. And we're going to start off by looking at the opening scene, and we can identify a variety of the impacts that the legacy of apartheid has had through elements of mise-en-scène, dialogue and cinematography. So we start off with this wide shot of the inside of Tsotsi's shack. It's dark, it's dingy, it's untidy, and to the left of the shot we can see a gas lantern and just one electric light. And already what we can start to see is we can start to see how that demonstrates the legacy of apartheid rule to us. In these townships, they are areas of poverty. There is no electricity for most of them, and we can see that demonstrated in the scene itself. We also can look at the dialogue between Butcher and App and the fact that they can't add 4 and 5 together, something that we would associate with learning very early on in primary school, demonstrates their lack of education. And again, that is an impact of the legacy of apartheid, where there are no educational opportunities for black Africans, so they are not getting the same level of education that we would expect them to have. Even the most basic addition is beyond them. And as Tsotsi and his gang leave his shack, we see a wide shot of the township. We see the shacks made of corrugated iron, women queuing up at a water pump. Again, it demonstrates that lack of resources, lack of access to amenities, lack of facilities, and the poverty that is endemic in these townships. Further into the opening scene, we see Tsotsi walk past the older gangsters, and we see how they're wearing the trappings of their crimes, thick gold chains, expensive clothing. They're all hanging round and leaning on this convertible car. And this demonstrates that legacy of apartheid and linking it to the violence and how crime and violence are a way out of poverty for young male black Africans, because they don't have access to other opportunities. As we've seen with App and Butcher, they don't have access to education. So crime and criminal acts and violent acts are one of the only ways of them escaping the grinding poverty which they're used to living under. And all of these elements of the opening scene can be linked back to the historical and social context that we've been looking at so far in the presentation. The next area of representation we're going to look at is representation of gender, and we're going to look at how that legacy of apartheid, the historical, social, cultural contexts can be applied to how gender is represented in Tsotsi. We're going to start off with the key scene of Tsotsi and Miriam meeting for the first time, and Tsotsi forcing Miriam to breastfeed baby David. And this is a scene that's commonly analysed because it is a scene that has lots of areas for analysis that can be linked to the wider context we've looked at. Starts off with that wide shot of the water pump and the queue of women waiting to use it. And there's a little detail here that shows you how women are represented and kind of shows you the social structure of gender in South Africa. And it's when Miriam allows a man to jump the queue to get his water first. And what that demonstrates to us is that South Africa at that point in time is a patriarchal society, and that women have to be subservient to men. All these women are queuing up for water, but Miriam feels obliged to let this man jump the queue in order to get his water first. She's subservient. She's allowing the man to dominate her. We look at the medium two shot of Tsotsi threatening Miriam with his gun, resorting to violence to get what he wants rather than any other method of persuasion. And again, that links to that cultural context that violence is a first port of call for young South African men, that they don't have the education or the social skills to be able to talk to people or persuade people in another way. And Tsotsi resorting to violence to get what he wants again demonstrates that legacy of apartheid and how violence is endemic and in South African culture. And what's amazing about this scene is the performance of Terry Fetto, who plays Miriam. Her body language, actions, her facial expressions, they all communicate what it must have been like for women living in a township. In South Africa, there is a high proportion of domestic and sexual violence because the legacy of apartheid has left a lot of men resorting to violence and resorting to crime to survive. And that comes into play with their interactions with everybody, especially women. In terms of religion, 80% of South African, black South Africans are Christian. And that means that they conform to traditional gender roles. So Miriam looks after the baby. Miriam feeds the baby. She is subservient. She collects the water. She's doing all those domestic chores. She's taking her place in a patriarchal society. And the mise-en-scène in this scene is really interesting as well, because what it does, it makes inferences about her specific circumstances and what they mean for the film's representation of gender as a whole. Miriam represents hope for the future of black South Africans, that post-apartheid they can make something of their lives. Her apartment is colourful, it's clean, it's tidy, it's a cosy space where she's raising her young child. And we compare that to Tsotsi's shack in the opening scene, and we see the difference in the legacy of apartheid that it has had on Tsotsi in terms of how it has impacted him. He's living in absolute poverty with no electricity, and he feels he is forced to turn to a life of crime in order to survive. The final area of representation we're looking at is representation of place. Now, we've already covered some aspects of this in the previous slides. We've looked at Tsotsi's shack and how it lacks access to electricity. We've looked at Miriam queuing up at the water pump, which demonstrates that there is limited access to running water. But there are other scenes in the film which also show the impact and legacy of apartheid on South Africa as a place. These shots are from different points in the film. The first one we're going to look at is the candlelit shot of Tsotsi's mother sick in bed. Now, again, the fact that it's candlelit demonstrates that the lack of electricity in the townships, but it also demonstrates the prevalence of HIV and AIDS. Over 20% of young South Africans 15 to 49 are living with HIV or AIDS, and that again is a legacy of apartheid, a legacy of the fact that hospitals and healthcare were extremely limited during apartheid for black South Africans living in the townships. And therefore epidemics like AIDS have been allowed to spread uncontrolled. We also get the shot of Tsotsi when he runs away from his father, sleeping in a section of concrete pipe to stay sheltered. And what's really important here is we see that concrete pipe twice in the film. We see it when Tsotsi is a young boy, when he's running away from his father, and then we see it almost 10 years later when he's a young adult and he returns there. Now, what this demonstrates is that whilst there is hope for South Africa and the townships to improve, that some of the materials are there and ready to increase the facilities and the amenities that these townships have, that they're still there 10 years later. And that demonstrates that not enough is being done to improve these townships, that these townships are still suffering from the lack of facilities, the lack of water, the lack of electricity that they would have suffered from under apartheid. And then finally we get a shot from very early on in the film, and it's John's house, who's baby David's father, and it's seen to be a considerably more affluent setting. It's a huge house, but there are small details in there which demonstrate that, again, that legacy of apartheid. There's high walls and fences. There's a security gate to get into the property. There's an alarm system in the house. And that demonstrates the darker aspects of South Africa and how even those who have increased their social status after apartheid are now having to protect themselves from other black Africans who are having to resort to crime and violence to try and bring themselves out of poverty. And it really shows the two differing aspects of post-apartheid South Africa. Some people are still trapped in this poverty trap and they're looking at violence and crime as their only way out, but it has provided some opportunities for some black Africans to increase their social status, to be able to increase their economic status as well. So we've got to apply these contexts to Tsotsi. In the extended exam questions on Tsotsi, you're going to be asked about representations of either age, gender, ethnicity, or place/culture, and applying the historical and cultural context of South Africa, and in particular the legacy of apartheid, will enable you to develop your exam responses. So across these four areas, these are where we can think about how that legacy of apartheid has impacted what we see in the film. In terms of representation of age, links can be made to the education system of South Africa and the challenges that young black people face. And these challenges were exacerbated by apartheid rule. Because there's a lack of educational opportunities, there's a temptation for black African males, especially young black African males, to fall into gang culture and the easy riches that it offers them. And it has a significant impact on those young African men. In terms of ethnicity, this is where you can link the legacy of apartheid rule directly to the characters in Tsotsi. The poor levels of education, the crime, the violence, the lack of healthcare, the townships themselves, they're all symptoms of decades of discrimination against black Africans. And despite apartheid ending, South Africa, and especially the townships of South Africa, are yet to bring themselves up to the same standard as the cities. In terms of representation of gender, women in South African culture have always been treated as second-class citizens within their communities and subservient in a patriarchal society. There's also very defined gender roles in South African society, and these are evident in the film. We obviously see that with the portrayal of Miriam being very maternal, protective of her child, her apartment, the domestic chores that she participates in. So we can see that representation of gender really evident in Tsotsi. And finally, representation of place and culture. This would be an accumulation of all the above representations alongside what the actual physical spaces present in Tsotsi look like. Tsotsi's shack, Miriam's shack, the concrete tubes that Tsotsi runs to find shelter in. And all of these show how apartheid rule has impacted South Africa as a place, and in particular the township as a place. And we consider the differences in those living spaces. Tsotsi's shack, Miriam's shack, John's house, they're all black South Africans, but representing different aspects of the townships in Johannesburg, and Johannesburg as a place, and South Africa as a place. So hopefully this will help you apply context, historical, social and cultural, to your extended exam questions on Tsotsi. Hopefully it's been useful, and I will see you again for another video. Good luck.